if you really think the end of the world is at hand, that has a kind of liberating and frantic energy that goes along with it. It's not good for quiet crowds and social stability. And given the emotional and religious tenor of this holiday anyway, to have somebody preaching that the kingdom of God was really on its way, perhaps it was going to be coming within that very holiday, preaching that in the days before Passover, it's the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater.
The Gospels agree that this politically charged climate was the occasion for his arrest. But what happened next, and the role played by the priests, remains unclear.
I think there's some kind of cooperation between the chief priests and Pilate. The chief priests always had to cooperate with Rome because it's their jobs. They're mediating between the imperial government and the people. And there was a perceived danger that Pilate was on the verge of some kind of muscular crowd control. People would get hurt or killed when Pilate felt so moved. And perhaps for this reason, Jesus was turned over to Rome.
The most difficult thing for us after 2,000 years is to bring our imagination down when we're looking at the Passion of Jesus, because we want to think the whole world was watching, or all of the Roman Empire were watching, or all of Jerusalem was watching. I take it for granted there were standing orders between Pilate and Caiaphas about how to handle lower class, especially dissidents who caused problems at Passover.
Jesus would have represented, a kind of activist and resistor in Pontius Pilate's experience that he had been dealing with for years, and with varying degrees of success and effectiveness, obviously. But Jesus would have been a blip on the screen of Pontius Pilate because the unrest and the uprisings were so common. Part of daily life for the Roman administration of Judea, that Jesus would have been seen, I think, as very, very little out of the ordinary.
Now, I don't for a moment think that Pilate would have been worried that Jesus could have challenged the power of the emperor. That's not the point. The point is, any challenge to Roman authority, any challenge to the peace of Rome, would have been met with a swift and violent response.
In dealing with a person who was guilty of sedition, Pilate had considerable leeway. He was probably driven by convention, and that is the process of executing state criminals through crucifixion.
There is no doubt in my mind but that the persons responsible for the actual execution of Jesus were the Romans. The Romans practiced crucifixion. While it was not unknown to the Jewish people, it was not a form of Jewish execution.
Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull.
A crucifixion site was usually near, say, a main road into the city. It was a warning location. The uprights for the crosses were usually left there permanently. And you have to think of that site as not a place where people would go regularly. It's an abhorrent site. It's supposed to be a warning, even when nobody is hanging there. So the idea that there would be crowds around the crucifixion, leave out Passover or anything like that, just watching, I think most people would probably avert their eyes and walk away because they don't want to be on the side of the Romans who are killing and crucifying one more good Jew among the thousands who'd been crucified in the first quarter of that century.
Death by crucifixion was certainly an awful experience for the persecuted individual. It was slow, it was painful, and it was public terror.
It's not from bleeding. It's not from the wounds themselves that the death occurs. It's rather a suffocation because one can't hold oneself up enough to breathe properly. And so over time, really, it's the exposure to the elements and the gradual loss of breath that produces death.
We don't have that much detail about the actual crucifixion of Jesus, what we have are the stories in the Gospels. And there, interestingly and appropriately, the Gospel writers are drawing on Psalms. Psalms that in the Jewish canon are often cries to God. And they're grabbing onto that literature to shape their narrative presentation of the crucifixion. Those are cries of terror and loneliness. They're really appeals to God for meaning. The words that are put in Jesus' mouth in Mark, "Why have you forsaken me?" It's the religious power of the Psalms that is really one of those wonderful moments of concrete continuity between what this very passionately religious first century Jew might have been thinking as he was dying this horrible death on the cross, and as the finale to this week of passionate religious excitement and commitment, and asking God what happened.
The plaque that was nailed to the cross is one of the few clear pieces of historical evidence that we have.
Jesus Nazareno, Rex Iodorum.
The plaque, which names him as Jesus, the King of the Jews, suggests that the charge on which he was executed was one of political insurrection, a threat to the Pax Romana. But he's also now a victim of the Pax Romana.